Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, you can stay host. I won't, there's no deck to present, meant to be a little conversational today. So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Misha. As Misha mentioned, I am an executive coach, but as a background, I've been a CISO, and of course, as a management consultant, I work with CISOs across organizations. And so over that time, I was able to observe what worked and what didn't. And I started a year and a half ago with the premise that there are things that often as technical folks, we are not paying attention to that have a significant impact on our success. And so that was my working premise. And I spent the last year and a half talking to cybersecurity executives, CISOs, and asking them what made a difference in their career. And had a number of interesting conversations. And between that and working with clients myself, have come to some working ideas on what will make a difference for careers in cybersecurity. So wanted to start with a couple working premises for this session and give that to you as sort of a way to work through the material. The first premise is that role success is distinct from your program success. So what I won't be talking about today is the tasks we're familiar with: pick a framework, assess security, identify gaps, create a plan, get some quick wins. I assume everybody in the audience today is familiar with that. What we will talk about is all the other things that will help you be successful. The second premise, and it's related, is this notion of what got you to where you are isn't necessarily what will get you to the next level or your next opportunity. All right, so first 90 days. This is a really interesting time for potentially changing the trajectory of your career. Fresh slate, new people, reset of how you think about yourself and how you think about your role. And there's a couple of things that in talking to executives, and this is across executives, CISOs and non-technical executives, that tend to lead to success. The first one is starting early. And so when I say start early, there are a number of things that you can do once you land. But those that have a plan and for the pre-entry period can make a significant difference in that landing. And I'll talk through a couple examples. One of the primary things that executives do, particularly those that are new to an industry, new to a culture, new to a particular level, is to seek people within the organization before day one. And the way this looks is as far as finding folks that you can talk to, you can find them in a number of different ways. The one way is the folks that you've interviewed with. So who did you resonate with? Who did you connect with? Who had an active interest in how you might operate in the role? And although many of us don't do this, and it can be, and I'll admit this myself, it can be sometimes uncomfortable to make that reach out. The time that you will spend with potential allies and collaborators and people that can give you insights before you get to day one will help shape your day one positioning, which puts you in a stronger position, of course, for the rest of the 90 days. So that is one thing. You probably already do the second thing, which is learning industry, reading 10Ks and whatnot. So I won't go into too much detail there, but the reason I'm bringing this up is as I've talked to people, there is sometimes the notion that I start on day one. And the reality is you start from your first interview and you're building your relationships, you're building your plan, you're building your messaging from that first interview through to your first day. And by the time you get to your first day, there should be a pretty well-defined message that you're bringing to the table that neither scares people or is overly bold, but tells them that you understand what role you're stepping into. So that is the pre-entry period. Once you land, there's a couple things that differentiate, and it's largely about focus. And focus becomes an interesting topic. The first area is, as we think about teams, there's teams that report to us, and there's work we have to do to get to know them, understand from them what the issues and concerns are, what's working well and whatnot, build those relationships and rapport, and essentially lead that team. What is sometimes overlooked is that that's actually our second team. The first team is the group that is comprised of your boss and the people that report to your boss. And they are allies in a number of ways. First, they can inform you and let you know about how to best work with your own boss. And they are pools of insight and approaches that, based on their own experience, they know what works. Secondly, they are at your level, and they are probably going to already be experiencing the types of stressors, organizational issues, organizational concerns that you will soon face as you get deeper into your role. The other thing that's really interesting about your peers is they can help you avoid landmines. And so one of the questions that I typically advise new CISOs to do is to ask your peers, what don't I touch? Who's favored? What are the sacred cows? And a couple simple questions like that can go a long way to understanding where not to go, how not to burn political capital, and how to navigate the organization. A couple things around that: meet with these folks individually. There is sometimes a tendency to use the boss's meeting to get to know these other team members or your peers, your first team, as Patrick Lencioni calls it. My recommendation is make them one of the first set of people that you meet your first week. And generally, they will help you avoid some of the issues I just talked about. The next thing is expectation setting. And a couple of you had questions around this, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the questions in the next section. But the one thing that I wanted to mention here is that setting expectations is a calibration exercise that is largely beneficial when you seek their expectations of your role. We have frameworks, we have approaches that we've used in the past. We understand the work that needs to be done. Many of you can probably walk into a room, talk to a couple of people, and literally be able to infer 80% of the problems that are within an organization in a relatively short period of time. So you know the work and you know how to get to understanding what needs to be done. The challenge sometimes is, how do other people view the role? Was the last person in the role disruptive? And so the most important thing for you to do perhaps is to smooth things out, to make bold moves that set a different expectation so that you're not carrying the burden of the prior person and the person previously in the position. What other political things have happened in the past? How has the role been seen in the past that may hinder or enhance your ability to get your job done? And so seeking the advice and input of what people expect, what they've experienced in the past, and how they see your role being successful significantly impacts your ability to be able to say later, look, I delivered on what you wanted. I delivered on what the organization needed, not the security stuff, the framework, CFS, whatever. There's a couple things around this, and some meetings, but listen and be genuinely curious. If in that meeting where you're seeking to understand what they expect of your role, you're talking more than 10 or 15% of the time, you might be telling them what you think the role is rather than listening to what they think the role is. And as difficult as it might be, sit quietly and listen and ask questions and do it from a place of curiosity, because they may have a wide range of expectations for you that either is unique to the environment, is totally unexpected and unlike anything you've experienced before, or perhaps isn't appropriate for the role, which isn't necessarily something to solve in that first meeting, but is something to be aware of so you can calibrate it later. The second part of understanding expectations of your role, and this connects a little bit to power base, which I'll talk about later. What are their goals and challenges? Setting aside what cybersecurity needs to happen in terms of cybersecurity, what challenges do they face? Are they having problems with vendors? Are they, tired of their boss? And there's probably a degree to which you want to keep it on the professional career type side. But what are they facing? What are their challenges? That does two things. It creates an empathy, and it also helps you, and this was one of the questions that came up as well, how do you align? And listening to their individual challenges, their pains is part of that process to figure out how to align. Tied to seeking others' expectations of your role is a third item, examining your assumptions about success. And what does that look like where you are now? In prior roles, especially if you've just been promoted up a rank, it was probably largely technical. And that may not be what is needed in the new role. There's a phrase that goes, what got you here won't get you there. And so it's this idea that success builds, and as that success builds, the expectations of what will take you to the next level are likely different. And so technical CISOs that come up the ranks may have to let go of being a technical CISO or some component of that technical skill set, which can be a challenge. The other thing the fourth thing to do in the first 90 days is seek help and supporters from non-traditional places. And I can give you a couple examples of this. When I was first a CISO, my CIO, who was, in retrospect, a fantastic CIO, set up meetings with all of his peers across the organization. Just one meeting, no commitment. And after that initial meeting, he said, who is the most interesting person you talked to? And I said, well, the chief strategist and data officer. And so he set it up so that I met with her on a regular basis. And it's not, at that time, strategy was a little bit far afield from a role that sat within IT. Enterprise strategy was a little far afield of a role that sat in IT. But she ended up being my biggest ally and had the ear of the COO. And I wouldn't have gone to her. It just wasn't something I thought about. She didn't have operational or functional responsibility for systems. But it turns out that one-off conversation in an unexpected place was the biggest support and the biggest expansion of my understanding of what the organization expected of my role. Other examples from some of my own clients. One of my clients is going through a merger, and his IT shop is quickly exiting. And so we talked through who in the organization he had resonated with, and potentially who would have a non-traditional landed on the chief revenue officer. And as it is unfolding still, I can't go into too many details, but that chief revenue officer is at this point taken the CISO under his wings. And it was not something that he expected at the beginning of the conversation to end up with, and certainly not where he expected to be several months ago. So seeking help from non-traditional places can pay off in very big ways. The last one, and this is something that is important at the beginning and is somewhat hard to do later, which is setting professional and personal boundaries. And there's two questions around this. One is determining what you're willing to do and what you are not willing to do to achieve your goals. And my experience with our field is that we're helpers, we're driven, we're motivated, and we're very accustomed to working all sorts of hours and in very unexpected ways. There's a reason that CISOs on average only last 24 months. Among them are burnout and a need to reset. And that the conversations early on about what you're willing to do and not willing to do can go a long way later on to preserving energy and being able to last longer in a role so that you can do more with it. So switching to midpoint actions, the way to think about this is there's a range of time. You're over the honeymoon period and you haven't quite decided to leave yet. That can be several months in the shortest cases. Or it can be perhaps, how do you get new inputs? How do you change your perspective? How do you take a situation which you know well and give it new life and give it a new approach? And time after time, when I've seen CISOs sort of get bored in the middle, the thing that tends to pay off is direct feedback. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by this. There are, there are different methods for doing this, but quite often the best way to do it is to seek internal advisors, trusted sources, people that have helped you in the past, and ask straight up, I'd like to expand. I'd like to be able to level up, perform at a different level, and I would love to pick your ear about what that could be. And I have 3 questions for you. What are 3 great things that I'm doing? What's one thing to improve? And if you've picked people that are relatively open, they will be open and share. And my recommendation is you pick 5 people to do this with. And coming out of that, pick a goal. So of those things, they're the 3 things that are great and the 1 thing to improve. And you can pick either. What do you want to optimize on the great side? Or what is 1 specific thing you want to change in the areas where they said to improve? And it's important in these conversations to be specific. So for example, you might get feedback that says, well, you're too blunt. Okay, well, that's pretty broad umbrella. Let's get more specific. Well, you're ready to jump in, give your opinion, and tell the other person why they're wrong almost right away. That's workable. Now you have an understanding of where it is that they're seeing that there could be an opportunity for improvement. And it is pausing, waiting, and listening. And so after you do this circle, this round in the middle, go back to those same people and elicit their help, enroll them. Say, hey, I've got a goal. Can you, once a month, tell me how I'm doing on this goal? You observe me, you hear me, we have chats once in a while. And I'd like to check back with you every month for several months to understand how I'm improving and what progress I'm making. And what's interesting about this is it's great for you. It is a great feedback mechanism. It can be very drive a lot of insights about your own, the way you operate. One of the side benefits is you now have a team that is rooting for you and seeing improvement, which can have ripple effects everywhere. And by asking for the help, you've called out and made it obvious that you've improved, which otherwise might not have gone noticed. As you're going through this process, there's a couple things to think about. And the power base, I'll just rattle them off: power base, power map, and influence map. And so as you're thinking about who to pick, and as you're thinking about how to approach them, there's a couple different lenses you can look through. Who has power in the organization? Who has an opportunity to shape what you do? Who has an opportunity to promote you? Who has an opportunity to squash you? And then determining who among those people you think you can influence and who you would value the feedback from, and building an influence map from that. How are you going to use this midpoint 360 feedback process, making explicit what you're doing, to raise your visibility, to raise your credibility, and to raise awareness of the way that you're growing and developing, and perhaps can take on new responsibilities, or to see skills and traits that maybe had otherwise not would have otherwise not gone noticed. So couple more, one more section before I get to a couple pitfalls and questions. So winding down, there's a number of interesting things that happen. And the point at which I would say this phase starts is I'm thinking about finding something new. And it's a vastly underutilized time period from the standpoint of you have essentially, and this is, I'm going to say this with a caveat, you have to use it responsibly. You have a time to take risks and a time to play with different approaches and styles in this period. You've presumably earned organizational capital, political capital, personal capital, and the ability, based on your success, to make some bolder moves at the end without being too disruptive. And so questions to ask oneself at this point is, what risks can you take? What are things that you've thought about doing but hesitated because you didn't want to disrupt what you had? If you're leaving, this is a good time to try those things. The other question to ask yourself, as I'm thinking about leaving, what could I do that literally sets me up for my next role? Is there some way I can stretch? Is there something I can do that normally wouldn't be part of my normal course of finishing out a role, that would give me cred and give me something to have built off of for my next role? So, and then as you think about that, and as you think about the things you might do, those become part of your story for the next role. So we're at 12:30. I'm going to go into a couple pitfalls. I'm going to respond to some questions that were sent in, and then we'll get to open Q&A. So pitfalls. There's a couple things that, having talked to people in our field, that are pretty common in terms of traps that we fall into. The first one is the meritocracy trap. And that is this idea that if we do what we're supposed to do, we'll be recognized, promoted, appreciated, or any of the other things that we're seeking in terms of our role. And it doesn't work. And so as you think about the things that I've just laid out, what are the ways that you can talk about what you've accomplished? How can you, in a natural and authentic way, share, hey, I had the success last week. Can we celebrate it together? Or can I just share it with you because I'm excited about it? And everybody has their own style in this space, but thinking that doing the work alone will get you there generally doesn't. Those of you that have had multiple CISO roles probably already know that. And those of you who are new to the CISO role, it's important to promote yourself. It is part of the job. The other thing that tends to be a trap is, and this is an overlay to everything I've said, is getting heads down, right? Get in, get focused on the work, support the team, respond to incidents. It's very easy to fall into that. And so whether it is you holding yourself accountable or having somebody to help you be held accountable to making sure that you are building relationships, that you're doing those things that are perhaps slightly less urgent, but critically important. And taking a moment to step back, look around and figure out what you need to do besides the work that's right in front of you, is also something that is tough to do. And even people that know that they want to not do that, it's very easy to fall into that default. So I'm going to move into questions. There were a number of questions that were submitted. Thank you for doing that. A lot of good questions in here. I've touched on some of them, but I wanted to touch on a couple in particular. And the way I looked at the questions, they fell into, how do I know I'm successful as a CISO? How do I build relationships and influence? How do I get support? How do I have tough conversations or sensitive conversations? And then a couple questions about board and team. So I'll just make a couple quick points about each of those areas in general and address the questions through doing that. So relationships and influence. There were the questions tended to be around alignment and building trust. And there's two perspectives to this potentially. There is alignment to where we expect the business to understand what we do and to understand why cybersecurity is important. And then there's an alignment that is, we understand the business and we seek to understand what the business needs and wants. And then cybersecurity is an aspect of that. And so the going back to the building, the first 90 days aspect of reaching out to these people and understanding what they expect of your role applies here. The fastest way to build trust is to listen. And part of the listening tour that I described will by default create credibility, create a sense of authenticity, that you're showing up with a genuine interest in the stakeholders that you're trying to influence, and that it demonstrates that that you're willing to partner, and it's not just about your own agenda. And so the listening aspect of that tends to allow those relationships to blossom naturally, and naturally engenders trust. There was another set of questions around support, like how do I convey the importance of cybersecurity without fear mongering? How do I get support from stakeholders? How do I deal with people who are opposed to my initiatives? The general approach there is very similar. It is going back to your power base, understanding who has influence, and having candid conversations about what their expectations are, how they want to be approached, what they're looking for from you in particular, will over time engender that support. And there's two things I wanted to mention here in terms of very specific mechanics. The first one is priming formal decisions. There's within any organization, there's formal and informal decision-making processes. And it's easy to default to the formal decision-making processes, but there are times and there are organizations where the informal decision-making processes are actually more important than the formal decision-making processes. So when I say priming formal decisions, that would be understanding who has a role in the decision and having conversations with them early, before you get in the room, before the budget cutoff, or budgeting process, before the budgeting process happens, before the above line and below line discussion is had. The other way to build support is borrowing credibility. And the way this is done is there are oftentimes, it's hard to penetrate sometimes for non-technical executives what the request is, how it impacts them. And frankly, sometimes they don't have time. If it's between how do I spend some cybersecurity budget versus how do I prevent a 10% shortfall this year, the CEO is going to think about the 10% shortfall and want to make quick decisions with you so they can focus on these bigger decisions. So how do you work around that? How do you give them information that helps them make faster decisions? So borrowing credibility is talking to people that the person you're pitching to, the person you're trying to get support from, people that they trust, people that they rely on for things other than cybersecurity. That could be the CFO, it could be chief product officer, it could be the head of finance, or I'm sorry, the head of sales, it could be any number of people. And so one of the ways to get faster decisions that are cleaner from executives or from your executive, is to talk to those people and then implicitly bring them in the room or explicitly bring them in the room through describing the conversations that you've had with the other people. And this allows shortcut decision-making, it allows confidence, it does a number of things psychologically. And those are two ways to build support: borrowing credibility and priming formal decisions through informal conversations. The board. So I wanted to spend a minute or two on the board because there was a couple questions here, and this is always a hot topic. How do I present to the board? What do I present to the board? What do they care about? That there is some variation on the board, but there are a couple things not to do. One is ask for funding or talk about unaddressed risks without a plan in front of the board. Those are two really big no-nos in most cases. Boards are looking to have you present information and let them know if any decisions need to be made. But generally, by the time you get to the board, those decisions should have been figured out and packaged and ready to offer to the board. There's questions around metrics. What metrics and reporting do I give to the board? What would I do in a quarterly update? Again, the board is typically not the place to advocate for things or air metrics. I rarely see metrics as such presented to the board. What I do see is storytelling that's supported by key numbers that are relevant to that story. So for example, one of my clients does quarterly, and the process to prep is pretty substantial considering it's such a public board, but very simple stories, very positive stories, a couple of numbers. And what you're looking for from the board is ongoing support. there are, pardon me, there is often very few metrics that you would present to a board on an ongoing basis. Those are more operational things that would be for the CEO. On team, there were a couple questions around teams. The short version is that the team, the biggest thing that cybersecurity teams tend to do is, again, focus on the technical work. Part of what I do is I facilitate teams at the director and up level, and there tends to be a focus on what needs to be done from the standpoint of we have technology and tools to implement. And as I work with these teams on what's going to help them be successful, it is going back to how do they operate as a team? How do they work as a team? How do they think as a team? And there's a couple key questions around team. The 4 questions that I really like to ask my teams, or when I work with teams that I facilitate, are: who are we? What do we do? Who are our customers? How do we know we're successful? And those 4 questions tend to drive a different approach to how cybersecurity is done. As far as connecting to the business, those questions will connect you to the business, and there's a component of morale there, that if they see the larger purpose and they understand who they're serving and how they know they're successful, that always drives up morale. All right, I think I covered most of the questions. There were quite a few. Again, thank you for submitting. I thought I would open it up to live questions.
So most of you are on mute, so if you want to ask a question, unmute yourself first. Chris, well, first of all, thank you so much for taking time for this. I think it's an amazing session. I actually have a question. I'm not sure if you saw, but recently there was a survey that came out, I think, from Heidrick and Struggles, and they surveyed several hundred CISOs, and kind of burnout and stress was some of the most prevalent factors impacting CISOs on the personal level. And I think you touched on this, and you mentioned setting up expectations right off the bat, but often kind of those expectations in times of crisis kind of get shifted, and if there's like an active breach or if there's a fire to be put out, those expectations are kind of are stretched somewhat. Can you maybe offer some specific examples on how to actively manage those so that to avoid some of the stress and the burnout that kind of usually comes with a role?
Yeah, so incidents are part of what we do, right? There's no way to avoid them. And what I've seen is 2 things. Being very, very clear that there are no guarantees. And this is something that we probably do, are all aware of, but maybe don't say enough. So talking about what the expectations can be during a breach and what's realistic and what that means and what participation from others means in terms of success of response. It's going to suck, right? Breach, big breach, whatever. You're going to work the weekend, you're going to work the week. If it's Log4j, you're doing it forever. There's just busy periods. And for the most part, we have to accept that. But understand, not having the expectations on your shoulder that it'll be a clean, complete recovery every time, and setting realistic expectations gives you some breathing room. Aside from that, there's a mechanic with CISOs that is fairly unique that having explicit conversations around can help. And what it is the distance between, or the gap between what we're responsible for and the amount of control we have over how likely that's to happen. So we all know this story, right? Somebody goes out, picks a vendor, goes through procurement, they never call us. Vendor's a mess. Some business decision is made, it has huge security implications, nobody talked to us. There's so much out of our control that alone creates a stress. It also leads to imposter syndrome, which is an entire topic we could spend a lot of time on, in terms of, how do I know I'm doing the right thing? How do I know I'm succeeding? Everybody is looking at me. Just acknowledging that there are things that you do not have control over, and being explicit about the impact to you personally and in your ability to do the role with your key stakeholders often lowers the pressure. It's not perfect. There's still going to be pressure, but having that honest, candid conversation and being explicit about, these are the challenges that I face, sometimes engenders some support, but definitely in this case, a problem shared is a problem reduced. Thank you for the question.
Certainly. Well, I know maybe some of you will be somewhat hesitant to ask a question that may be sensitive or personal. I'm sure towards the end of our session, Chris, you're going to provide your contact details. So there's obviously some continuity. So you would be able to kind of reach out and connect in a sidebar conversation. But I mean, obviously, if you do have questions that you're comfortable asking, feel free to go ahead. And as we kind of getting close to the time limit here, I know, Chris, you work with a lot of clients, a lot of CISOs. Just kind of roughly looking at your experience in that area, what are the top 3 factors that led to success from a career perspective, from the personal perspective, from the people you worked with? And you touched on some of the pitfalls, but again, top 3 pitfalls that may derail someone's career.
So I think I heard 2 different things. What are the 3 keys to success and 3 pitfalls? Or which?
Well, 3.
I can do both.
3 factors that propelled one's career, and 3 pitfalls that could completely derail someone's career as a cybersecurity executive.
Yeah. Time after time, when I talk to executives, when I talk to CISOs, and I ask what the most pivotal moment of their career is that led to success, is they said, I had somebody to talk to. Straight up. Like, whether it's a mentor, whether it's somebody who understands, often it's somebody that's a little bit less, a coach. That could be somebody from a prior position that you just resonated with, but having somebody that has a sense for who you are, understand your goals, and can be sympathetic is huge.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons that people reach out to me versus another executive coach is I sat in this chair, honestly, having empathy and a little bit of encouragement. The 2 other things that I've heard most often and I've seen most often are creativity. Like, how do I get creative in this role? Yeah, there's a lot of technical pieces, but how do I think about this differently? So that came in the form of epiphanies, that came in the form of having a random conversation with somebody at a bar. It didn't really matter. It was about being creative about what you're trying to solve. And that was probably the second biggest. And then thirdly, I think it is in bringing the same intensity and sort of consuming energy that we do for the cybersecurity work, and thinking about it from an executive perspective. Yes, I'm a CISO, but more importantly, I'm a business executive. How do I take the same energy, passion, and systems thinking and all the other things that we do well and apply it to the business executive hat? And those are probably the 3 biggest things I consistently hear.
And as far as pitfalls? And
then 3 pitfalls. I kind of mentioned them. They're the traps. So meritocracy is a huge one, thinking that we'll do the work and magic will happen. The other one, I'm going to go back to my notes, being heads down, right? Getting so caught up in the work that you forget to do these things that at an instinctual level, or sort of you had a plan to do. Go talk to the CEO. Before you're hired, take the chief marketing officer for lunch, right? Whatever it is, you have an instinct that says, maybe I should do this, but then the work draws you back. Being able to pause, like not falling into that, or that's a big trap that if you can avoid falling into, is going to open doors. And then probably the other one is, there's a little bit of hubris in our field. Showing up with the answer isn't always the best way to go. And that goes back to the listening thing, like ask questions, be genuinely curious. Don't think you know the answer, and really seek to understand what people are going through, because you're going to better connect. So yeah, don't think you always have the answer. That's the third pitfall.
Awesome. That's excellent. So a question to the group. Do you have specific questions for Chris you want to ask right now? Or maybe, I know you shared your contact details, maybe later. So we'll give you a chance to jump in. We have a few minutes left.
And I will say, I would love some questions here, but some of this is personal. And I will say that my experience has been asking questions around career, asking questions that actually require vulnerability. Hey, I feel like I'm really worried about this thing, or I don't have this on lockdown. It can be hard to do in front of a larger group. And in fact, a lot of people steer away from having these conversations because it's uncomfortable. So if you can ask a question here, that's great. But if not, well, that's kind of expected in a way, because it does require a little bit of vulnerability and openness to.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, I know we're gonna...
probably the tougher question. Like yeah.
I guess I
okay.
guess
I have a yeah.
This is Tim. So, do you have clients that you help get out of a CISO role and more into a CTO role, or even the CIO role, right? It just seems like a natural transition, just because the CISO tends to talk about the CIO's space when they're doing their presentations to the board, right? And it's a weird position when you're talking about someone else's work who's probably sitting right next to you.
Yeah, that is awkward. So just to double check, your question is, do I have clients that are attempting to move from the CISO to a CIO or CTO role? And
no, from CISO to a CIO.
From CISO to a CIO.
Yeah.
Yes, and the much of what I said applies. There, in terms of having those conversations, building relationships, establishing the power base. There are specific, like any type of transition, there's things to let go of, and that's often the hardest part. What I have found is that the most difficult part of that CISO to CIO transition is two things, actually. It's easier to be passionate and focused about security than it is about technology generally for most of us. And so what's my motivation? How does that work? And if your motivation is salary or title, it becomes easier. But if you're very strongly motivated by the CISO, but you want to do the actual work of the CISO and you want to move to a CIO, it can be trickier. The other thing is just wildly different relationship to technology. And so thinking in terms of revenue optimization versus revenue protection, for the most part, is a bit of a mindset shift. And so that tends to be the other difficulty. So.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. And then I have a question in chat here. How do you deal with the situation where the CISO reports to the CTO and doesn't have a seat at the exec table. So this is something I hear a lot. I don't have a seat at the table. I don't report to the CEO. And I don't always feel like I'm invited or wanted. Tends to happen a lot. And so usually that's handled by most organizations in terms of a dotted line. But if you're looking to level up in terms of your relationships and the strength or the influence of the relationships you have, there's different approaches here. The best one is probably, depending on your situation, the permission model, and asking for skip levels. Not all CTOs or CIOs will go for that. And if they're not really keen to let you have that exposure, you don't have a ton of options. But going lateral is usually an option. And from that, you can infer and learn a lot of things, and perhaps, sorry, my dog, and perhaps build relationships in not explicitly end rounding the person you report to, but getting insights to how to connect, better your message, and help this CTO or CIO be more ready and willing to let you have that conversation, because you're taking a broader perspective to them. And that is typically the biggest. One is power. Two is, I'm not comfortable that the person that reports to me is ready to have that conversation, because they're at this level. Their altitude is 10,000 feet. The conversations I'm having with my peers is 20,000 feet. And the next level up is 40,000 feet. I don't have confidence they're going from 10,000 feet or ready to go from 10,000 feet to 40,000 feet. And so going lateral and up, learning more about the organization is one way to better prepare and demonstrate that you're ready to make the altitude change.
Any other questions?
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just I got my contact information in there. For this group, if you want to have a conversation, I'm happy to have an initial conversation. Maybe you're facing a specific challenge. Maybe there's a question you didn't want to ask here. The reality is your situations are very specific. So the advice that I've just given is a very broad overlay, and it won't necessarily be the answer for you. Within any of these areas, there are several answers. One's going to fit you, or several of them might fit you in the situation better than anything I've said here. And it's easier to get to that in a one-on-one conversation. So you have my contact information. Please reach out either immediately or whenever you run into something down the road.
Sounds good. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I think this was phenomenal. I think it was, to be frank, I think your presentation can be put into 60 different quotes. I think it's very punchy. I think it's very impactful. So again, a round of applause, I guess, around the table. Thank you so much for your time. And I would encourage all of you, if you do have specific questions, feel free to reach out to Chris. And again, hopefully it was productive for everyone. And please send, even if you don't have specific questions, just send a quick thank you to Chris, and hopefully we'll get to do this again for a larger group, and we'll address a bigger audience at the time.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Misha, and thank you everyone for participating and being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.